Hello there, I'm Noel Hacegaba, Chief Operating Officer at the Port of Long Beach. Welcome to Supply Chain Insight, where we discuss the latest news, issues, and trends in the supply chain with top industry leaders, experts, and influencers. Our objective is to bring you the insight you need to help you keep your cargo moving. Today's business executives expect a lot from their supply chains: efficiency, velocity, flexibility, cost management, and operational excellence. Supply Chain Insight brings you the supply chain to you one segment at a time to explore new approaches and innovative solutions that will help you and the Port of Long Beach deliver greater value to our customers and partners. In today's episode, we will talk with Elaine Nessle, the Executive Director of the Coalition for America's Gateways and Trade Corridors. CAGT is dedicated to the expansion and transformation of America's freight and goods movement infrastructure. Its members include leading transportation associations, trade corridors, state and local government agencies, rail, trucking, and engineering companies, and ports like the Port of Long Beach. As CAGT's Executive Director, Elaine helps unite a large and growing number of public and private organizations around the need for increased federal investment in intermodal freight infrastructure. She's also managing the coalition's efforts to increase awareness of the benefits of trade infrastructure development and coordinates legislative strategy and support. Elaine has nearly 20 years of experience working in transportation policy, with a particular focus on freight across all modes. She graduated from St. Bonaventure University with a BA in journalism and mass communications. Elaine, welcome to Supply Chain Insight. We're thrilled to have you on today. And the Port of Long Beach is proud to be a member of CAGT. And of course, it's my pleasure to serve as the port's representative on the board of directors.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm delighted to be here. And the Port of Long Beach was among our founding members in CAGT, so it is like a homecoming to be here with you and have this conversation.
And we are certainly honored to be a founding member and honored to have you here in person in our building. So Elaine, for those who may not be as familiar with CAGT, tell us about the coalition, your mission, and how your work supports the nation's supply chain.
So the coalition was founded about 25 years ago, and at the time, many of the organizations talking about freight and transportation were divided by mode. And so as an organization, we were formed by our members to begin talking about the end-to-end supply chain and also to raise the level of awareness with lawmakers on the need for federal investment, and that truly state and local governments and agencies cannot go at it alone when they are talking about moving nationally significant freight nationally significant freight that the entire nation and economy depend on.
Yeah, you know, it's hard to believe that it's been over 20 years since CAGT's founding. And from the beginning, CAGT was founded to bring attention to the importance, as you said, of America's freight transportation network to the nation's economy. Mm-hmm. So what are some of the legislative actions and investments that have materialized since CAGT's founding?
One of our long-standing asks is to ensure that the funding delivered by the federal government is flexible. And when we're talking about flexibility, we're talking about it in a couple of different ways. Number one, it needs to be flexible for the applicants. So for many, many years, state DOTs were the primary recipient of federal funds. And so CAGT's big push has been to expand that so that state DOTs can apply, but also seaports, MPOs, cities, and other public agencies that have significant freight infrastructure investment needs. So that's one type of flexibility. The other is modal flexibility and a recognition that we are not moving freight on highways alone. For a very, very long time, the federal government only saw its role in investment through the lens of highway spending. And as we have grown, as the economy has grown, as our goods movement, shipping demands have grown, we need to be looking at all of the above. And so the ability to invest federal dollars across all modes so that local agencies and states and other public agencies have the maximum amount of flexibility in where they spend the funds is another key priority of CAGT's.
And certainly there are a lot of accomplishments in that vein, from legislative policy that's been passed, funding programs that we'll get into in a moment. But what I really appreciated about CAGT is you really paint the broader picture. The freight transportation network really is vast, cuts across different industries and sectors. And so having that broader view when you're advocating for these precious dollars is so important. Let's talk about supply chain resilience, because it's top of mind for all involved in goods movement these days. How do investments in the nation's freight transportation infrastructure strengthen supply chain resilience?
It's a great question. I think that it happens in a few different ways. First of all, we talk about redundancy across the supply chain and ensuring that if there is a choke point in the system, freight has the ability to move elsewhere and reach its ultimate destination. Whether that choke point is a natural disaster or a man-made disaster, it can happen in many different shapes and forms, but we need to be prepared. We've seen too many instances over the last few years of these catastrophic events that really do throw a wrench into the entire goods movement system across the country. And so having redundancy built into the system is one way that we can increase our efficiency. We also need to be sure that our existing infrastructure assets are up to the task. We can't invest once and then leave them behind and think that they will not need sustained and continued investment. That is such a basic and elementary concept that all of us have in our day-to-day lives when it comes to our cars and our homes, et cetera. But we need to be ensuring that we are making continuous maintenance upgrades to our freight and goods movement supply chain infrastructure.
And recent history has reminded us it doesn't matter what the source of the disruption is, but when there's disruption anywhere in the supply chain, it has a tendency to cascade across, whether it was the collapse of the Francis Scott Key Bridge or the drought at the Panama Canal, the supply chain crisis, for example. So thank you for talking about the connection between investments in infrastructure and resilience. Now, for those in our viewing audience who may not be aware of how the federal government funds transportation, give us a high-level overview of that process, the key committees, funding programs that create dollars for transportation.
Sure, I'm happy to. And I will say at the outset that this is a process that is a bit outdated. It needs some refreshing because we have continued to run into a question of where the money is going to come from. The primary source for years and years has been derived from a gas tax that you pay at the pump and that truck drivers pay at the pump. But that fee has not been increased since 1992. A lot has happened since 1992. Vehicles have become more fuel efficient. People have switched to alternative fuel vehicles. People are driving less at different periods depending on what the economy is looking like. And so that has proven to be a source of funding that needs a refresh. For years and years, Congress was looking at the possibility of increasing that fee because it was not indexed to inflation. And so its purchasing power was continuing to diminish. But now I think that where Congress is really looking is what is the future? We need to be thinking about alternative fuel vehicles that are not paying into the system at all and making sure that we're capture that. So things like a parity fee on EV fuels or on EV vehicles or a vehicle miles travel tax are being considered. But as I said, for years and years, we just have not been collecting a sufficient amount of money into the system. And so Congress has supplemented that a great deal by taking money out of the general fund of the Treasury to help make sure that we do have robust funding to make necessary infrastructure improvements. But it's an ongoing conversation.
And it sure sounds like we're still due for that refresh, right? Bringing policy up to date with reality. So speaking of the Congress, earlier this year, legislators on the House Committee on Transportation and Infrastructure kicked off the 119th Congress with an ambitious hearing schedule to begin outlining their transportation priorities. Now, the good news is that the committee is well poised to begin its important work with continuity and leadership. We've got Chairman Sam Graves and Ranking Member Rick Larsen. With the bipartisan infrastructure law expiring in fall of 2026, this Congress will be primarily responsible for producing a new comprehensive bill to reauthorize the nation's surface transportation programs. How are things looking right now, and what are you hearing?
So the question of money is always looming large over these conversations. So that continues to be a big question mark as we head into the policy piece of this and thinking about what programs should be reauthorized. I think that the general sense is that Congress is looking to do a fair amount of consolidation and trying to figure out which programs were included in the last reauthorization bill, the bipartisan infrastructure law, also known as the IIJA, the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. And that had a large number of investment programs. And so already there is some consideration of which of these programs can be combined and consolidated. So I think that that's one direction that the committee is headed. I think that we will probably see some pretty serious considerations on the formula apportionments that go to state departments of transportation for their core highway needs. And as an organization, CAGT and its membership, we are going to continue to talk about the very positive benefits that we have seen from the investments made available under the last surface transportation authorization so that we can be sure to really highlight those successes and also point out some improvements that can be made under those programs as we move forward and advance them.
And thanks for that. I'm glad you went there. So what are CAGT's priorities and recommendations? If you had these key committees right in front of you, what would you tell them?
So first and foremost, we are looking at a big number, and you've got to start big and bold to get what you really want and what you need, because the truth is that the freight system needs a lot.
That's right.
And it's the economic engine, and it is fundamental to everything that we do in this country. So the number that we are looking at is a 50% increase across all programs that support freight and goods movement infrastructure. We arrived at that number by looking at the inflationary increases that have taken place since the IIJA was passed in 2021. Since that time, according to the Federal Highway Administration's Highway Cost Construction Index, we have lost 50% of the purchasing power from the money in the IIJA. And so in order to move forward, we need to see a 50% increase. Otherwise, we are just treading water.
So when you say big and bold, you weren't kidding. I mean, that's, and you know, when you talk about the economic impact and why this is necessary, I like to say that goods movement is literally the economy in motion. So an investment in freight infrastructure is literally an investment in the economy, right? So
absolutely.
That's, I'm really grateful that you were able to share this platform with the audience. And I know you, CAGT is hosting your annual conference coming up in DC. You want to share with the audience a little bit about that? Please.
So May 14th and 15th, we will have our annual fly-in in Washington, D.C., and transportation leaders from across the country gather. And we have a rich dialogue about trends that we are seeing in the industry, and we invite the key committee staff to come and have a discussion about their boss's visions for the future of surface transportation reauthorization, and you will be moderating that panel, and we're very much looking forward to a great discussion.
Thank you.
And we also have invited officials from the U.S. Department of Transportation, and they will be joining us to talk about their priorities in the coming years as they pertain to freight and goods movement. And we also want to hear from industry. What are they seeing? That drives a lot of our discussion. We need to hear from industry in order to more effectively communicate with Congress and the administration on the industry's needs.
I like to say that when it comes to CAGT's annual conference, it's a great way to gain insight on all the key issues facing not just the industry, but the Congress as it relates to transportation. So another item of particular interest to many of your members is changes in trade policy. Recently, President Trump announced a series of reciprocal tariffs on America's trading partners. What are you hearing from your members?
Sure. I think that our members certainly want an economy that works for everyone. And so as we think about shifting trade policies, we want to be sure that we are telling the story about the jobs that are directly reliant upon goods movement and trade in the U.S. According to the U.S. Department of Transportation, 44 million jobs are directly related to freight and trade in the U.S. And so those are real jobs at stake as we consider shifting trade patterns and recognizing that things don't happen overnight. And so as we consider reshoring manufacturing and other efforts of that nature, these are really perhaps long-term initiatives. And so anything that it shifts related to trade agreements needs to be thoughtful and considerate of timelines to be sure that we're not disrupting the delicate jobs balance that we have right now based on the current arrangements in the global marketplace.
And thanks for that insight, Elaine. Recently, the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative also held hearings on proposed Section 301 actions, namely the proposed fees on Chinese-built and Chinese-operated vessels. These fees range from $1 to $1.5 million per port call, so nothing small. What are you hearing from your members on how these fees could potentially affect the nation's supply chain?
I think that the most interesting part about this is the diversity in CAGT's membership and their reactions to the proposal. We are not simply an organization made up of ports. We have a great number of members who are inland in the country, and they have concerns about how exports are going to reach their markets, because as we think of vessels having fewer calls at ports, that is going to present fewer opportunities to have exports on return calls on those vessels. So it's not just a port issue, it's an entire United States economy issue. And of course, we recognize the ultimate goal of this is to increase domestic shipbuilding capacity, which is very much needed. But these fees are also likely to add to the cost of materials that would eventually be used in building those ships domestically here. And so we need to factor that into all of these equations, that these actions really do drive up the cost of making things here in the United States. And so again, purposeful decision making that is very considerate of all of the ripple effects that will be across the entire economy. This is not simply a port issue, even though that's the first point at which an impact would be felt.
And as you pointed out earlier in the conversation, you need to make sure that that thorough way for that container is seamless from end to end. So I like what you said. It's got to be purposeful decision making, right? Think about it thoughtfully. How do we get there from here? Because I'm not seeing a lot of pushback on the ultimate vision. Right. Every member and every stakeholder that I talk to supports American jobs, supports American manufacturing. But it's just how do we get there from here? So let me end with a question that I've been asking each of our recent guests on Supply Chain Insight. What advice do you have for those in the audience who are tasked with navigating uncertainty and managing disruption for the balance of the year?
I am going to give the advice that I have been using on myself, which is sleep on it. Take one night to sleep on it, because of course things have been moving incredibly fast over the past few months, but you really do need an appropriate amount of time to reflect on what is happening and anticipate all of the impacts. Each one of these activities that we just discussed in this brief conversation has such far-ranging and wide-reaching impacts that you really need to have quiet time to reflect on these things. And I'd also say, I know that one of my favorite parts of my job is interacting with all of my colleagues and friends who I have made in this industry. And so having an active line of communication with all of these experts in your network is absolutely invaluable.
Yeah. Well, Elaine, thank you again so much for joining us and sharing your exceptional insight. It's very much appreciated, especially during these times of so much uncertainty. And to our viewing audience, thank you again for joining us for another episode of Supply Chain Insight. We'll see you again soon for another episode brought to you by the Port of Choice, leading green for 20 years, the Port of Long Beach.